Good morning, good evening, depends on where you're joining from. So it's quite late for some of us, quite early for others. Thanks for joining. My name is Christoph Brodnik. I work as an independent researcher supported by the Austrian Institute of Technology. I also work as a knowledge manager for Monash University and the Monash Sustainable Development Institute here in Melbourne, Australia. The title of today's session is Capacities and Capabilities for Transformative Missions, Global Perspectives. And we've chosen the title Transformative Missions to really encapsulate this idea that research and innovation has to contribute to addressing grand societal challenges. So not just technology missions, the moonshot missions that we hear very often, but really contributing to those wicked problems that we're facing. So this topic has gained significance. Many governments are working on this, but there is no blueprint for doing this. So very happy that we have three experts joining here today from Austria and Australia who will share their knowledge with us and their experiences in working on this topic. Caetano Penna unfortunately had a family emergency, so he's not able to participate, but we do want to acknowledge his contribution to creating this event and shaping this event. Briefly about TIPSI. TIPSI is a global partnership to orient science, technology, and innovation towards the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. TIPSI is a program of research, experimentation, and learning about transformative research and innovation policy. TIPSI is made up of core members, associate members, as well as a community of knowledge and practice that make up this partnership. And it's administered by SPRU at the University of Sussex Business School, by UGlobe at Utrecht University, and by Ingenio in Spain. So this open learning series is part of one of the many activities of TIPSI. It's a global learning and networking event. So it's a community-led space. Today we have participants from over 28 countries and nearly every continent except Antarctica is represented. So we encourage you to use the chat and the breakout rooms to actively connect with each other. So the plan for this session, we have two presentations by our three experts. As I said before, Caetano Penna is unfortunately not able to make it today, but we have Petra Wagner present, and then we have Simon Fielke and Amelia Olsen-Boyd from CSIRO present, and I'll introduce the speakers just briefly before their presentations start. We have, after the presentations, also networking and knowledge sharing part where we go into breakout rooms. So please be prepared to switch on your cameras and have a discussion about this topic. We then reconvene in the plenary where we ask you to briefly put your highlights from the breakout rooms into the chat. And then Vicky and I will moderate a discussion, a brief Q&A around those highlights that you have heard from the conversations in the breakout rooms. Before we begin, I also want to thank Victoria Shaw, Pip Bolton, and Ani Chadari from the University of Sussex in making this event possible. So our first presenter is Petra. Petra, I will share your slides shortly. Petra is the Deputy Head of Center for Innovation Systems and Policy at the IIT Austrian Institute of Technology, Austria's largest research and technology organization. As a senior expert advisor, Petra has helped to develop and co-design EIT Food's mission on healthier lives through food, and thereby helping to focus EIT Food's core activities on high-impact domains. Petra, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph, and thank you for everyone joining today. It's so great to see many of you here. Actually, so what I'm going to do today is I will be talking more about the co-design, as Christoph said, that we did for EIT Food, and I will actually explain what EIT Food is about in a second, because not all of you may be familiar with who and what EIT Food stands for. And yeah, let's jump to the next slide, because this one is actually giving you a brief overview of what I would like to share with you today, which is, on the one hand, I would like to put the case for action into the center of what I'm sharing. So why did EIT Food start working on missions in the first place? And then also what we agreed upon is share with you some defining elements of this co-design process that enables the EIT Food as an innovation agency also bring its ecosystem on the way in this journey. I will also set the scene with you, on the one hand, by sharing EIT Food's mission-led approach as strategic initiative, and focus a little bit also on the mission, healthier lives through food itself, so you have a better idea why this mission is really also a transformative one in our understanding. And the last part of my presentation will then focus on the co-design approach itself. I will also go a little bit into detail about what one of the frameworks that we used, and which is the dynamic ecosystem capabilities one. So that's in a nutshell. And let's go ahead with the next slide. Christoph, please. Yeah. So the EIT Food, what is the case for action? Why did EIT Food decide actually to go on a mission-led approach? So for all of those of you who are not so familiar with EIT, the European Institute of Technology, as it's called, is a part of the Horizon Europe framework program. It brings together different organizations working in fields of education, research, but also innovation, and brings them together to form partnerships and cross-border meaning cross-sectoral, cross-regional, anything that helps to make the topics more systemic and create environments that actually foster innovation. There are so far 9 what is called knowledge and innovation communities working on different topics, and EIT Food is one of them. If you continue, Christoph, please. Yeah, so EIT Food, one of those 9 thematic knowledge and innovation communities that have been created about 7 or 8 years ago. EIT Food itself aims at building a future-fit food system. So food systems change is at the heart of what EIT Food is doing in order to produce healthy and sustainable food for all. So that's kind of what EIT Food is about. And what I think is also important to know is that EIT Food itself has created a community which is one of the largest food innovation ecosystems globally, so with a couple of hundred members. So EIT Food has been working on supporting innovation, business creation, education for a couple of years. And about 2 or 3 years ago, it faced certain challenges. And these challenges had more or less to do with the change in framework conditions for EIT Food itself, and also to its role. EIT Food started as an innovation supporter and also funder. So EIT Food has funding to support all the activities that I have been describing, and has actually over the years come into a situation where they found themselves to be actually more a funding than an innovation agency, meaning they were faced with a lot of bureaucracy within themselves, and also partners kind of resonated that. And on the second important development they noticed was that their framework condition changed in terms of decreasing funding. So part of the EIT Food funding model is that after 7 or 8 years, the public funding by the European Commission starts to decrease. And with the aim that after 14 to 15 years, so another 7 years, the EITs actually become financially autonomous. So this is now a big shift they need to make from really becoming a funder to actually becoming what they call themselves more an impact investor. So trying to drive impact, but also as a business model to invest themselves in these activities so that eventually they become financially sustainable. So quite big challenges. And one of the solutions was actually then thinking about major strategic initiatives supporting this change And one of the key ones was actually to introduce a mission-led approach. And yeah, let's move on with the slides. Yeah, before I go into details, just a brief overview of the 3 missions that have been actually introduced. So the first one is Healthier Lives Through Food, which I will be focusing on today, which will hopefully make a material difference to quality of life by enabling more consumers to have better choices through access to more affordable but also healthy products and actionable information. And the 2 other missions that have been elaborated was the net zero food systems and the reducing risk for a fair and resilient food system. So as an overview, the 3 missions, as I said, I will be focusing on the first one, Healthier Lives Through Food. Okay, that's it. Thank you. So why is this mission one that hopefully is truly transformative? We find that the non-communicable diseases are a leading threat to human health. So heart-related diseases, stroke, diabetes 2, cancer, especially colorectal cancer, but also Alzheimer, are among the leading causes for deaths in Europe and also globally. And unfortunately, unhealthy diets and physical inactivity are among the leading causes for those NCDs. And so the vision for this mission, Healthier Lives Through Food, is to hopefully achieve more healthy life years for all, so that we do not age longer, but we should hopefully all age healthier and happier. So kind of this is the vision behind the mission, Healthier Lives Through Food. More concretely, the 2 main inroads are reducing the relative risk of obesity and also the prevalence of these NCDs in target populations that are based on dietary factors. So is one of the root causes is obesity, and hopefully also used with that. The second is to actually reduce the economic burden that is associated with these diseases, and which are, as is here also, which is preventable due to changes in the diet. So this is sort of the vision behind the mission. And with the next slide, please. Yeah, I would actually like to go more into detail to the co-design approach. With the help in co-designing, what was expected from us was to provide scientific evidence, so a scientific evidence base, and also engage and consult with the stakeholders to identify those R&I topics that actually are expected to have the largest impact in that area, and subsequently also identify concrete needs, ideas, priorities, and recommendations. EIT Food commissioned that study or research activity to an interdisciplinary team of experts from both academia and industry. Industry is a very important partner and also change agent in food systems transformation, and which was led by IIT. So this is why I'm sharing this with you today. And at this point, I would also say that this is the presentation given by me on behalf of the team. It does not necessarily reflect all the positions by EIT Food. So this is my personal and professional presentation today for you. Okay, and also I think important to know is that this activity that we did and all its outputs are part of the strategic initiative of EIT Food, which started about 2 years ago, and has quite fundamental outcomes also in terms of business planning and decision making that is going on now until 25, which is the next planning period and beyond. Our co-design approach had 2 major phases. Phase 1 focused on scoping the priorities on which EIT Food should be focusing on, and phase 2, which was then shaping the actual pathways to impact. So this is outlining our approach. And before I dive into details with the next slide, I would like to share some important concepts that actually informed our work. And one is that, as I said, EIT Food is actually has been building an innovation ecosystem, and in order also to build a mission with and for an ecosystem, it's important to understand that an ecosystem is kind of alignment structure of different sets of partners that actually need to interact in order to shape a focal value proposition. So it's really important also to always keep in mind that we need to start with a value proposition. So building on the vision that I have been sharing, and then identify actors and activities that actually need to interact to make that, to actually materialize the value proposition. And usually in ecosystems, there is a central actor. So innovation ecosystems just don't emerge by themselves. Usually there is a central actor that actually sets the system level goal. In this case, the mission. So EAT Food had done some work in identifying the mission in the first place, and we helped them define the partner roles and also establish routines and interfaces necessary to actually mobilize the ecosystem also for this kind of work. As a central actor, EAT Food's role is also ecosystem orchestration. And with orchestration, we mean, and that is again from the literature, a set of deliberate and also very purposeful actions that both initiate and manage innovation processes in order to exploit opportunities. And they include partnerships, infrastructure, governance issues, and this whole bunch of value creating and value capturing activities that are necessary for an ecosystem to thrive. Mm-hmm. So with that in place, we actually used, or sort of in the background for our work, a dynamic ecosystem capabilities framework. And in the next slide, I would like to briefly share this kind of conceptual background with you. So, because I think it might also be useful for other activities. So this framework actually has the dynamic ecosystem capabilities at its core. And there are three main areas that are important to actually build and then maintain the capabilities. So dynamic ecosystems capabilities themselves are all about making the orchestration of the ecosystem performance in a kind of proficient, so a rather more business-oriented approach. And the three main areas are actually focusing on sensing. So this is kind of the bubble on top. So sensing includes the ability to identify opportunities, particularly for industry, but also other related stakeholders, new business opportunities, and also new partners. So sensing who is out there and what is out there as an opportunity. Then you also need to seize opportunities. So that's kind of on the bottom left, which includes the ability to realize the value proposition associated also with missions, and as I will be showing, the different sort of pathways associated with the mission for various stakeholders. So while there is a shared vision or a shared value proposition, it might not be exactly the one. It might be different for the various individual stakeholders. And it's also seizing means also to form partnerships, not just identify the partners, but really form new partnerships. And last but not least, the third pillar is ecosystem reconfiguring, because you need to adapt. So with a new sort of strategic goal or with a mission, it's necessary to offer, to actually adapt also services, offers of any kind to these changing framework conditions. And last but not least, also reorganize the ecosystem structure. So for instance, take the entire ecosystem and restructure it or them, for instance, in sub-ecosystems that actually focus on different kinds of missions. So that would be one way. So this is kind of the heart of the dynamic ecosystem capabilities framework. However, it also is important to have in mind and start with the ecosystem challenges. I had already outlined the sort of changes in the framework conditions, but also the mission itself as a focal point. And then once sort of these capabilities have been identified and developed, it's also important, and that's kind of what is on the right-hand side, to make sure that this kind of orchestration of all actors and activities are properly taken care of, and mechanisms are put in place that all these activities can be aligned. And always important is to have the ecosystem benefits in mind as well. So these are the most important elements, I would say, the core elements that make up this dynamic ecosystem capabilities framework. So with that, I think that's it for the conceptual part of it, but I do believe it's very important to better understand actually what we did, because this framework is not only was not important for us in designing and developing, but it's really impacting and still actually is the very operative work that EIT Food is doing these days with and for its ecosystem partners. Okay, then let's go ahead. So how did we go about finding the priorities for the mission? So as I said, we had two phases. One was kind of scoping the environment and see what is important, and then actually shaping them with the community, with the ecosystem. We started with desk research, we did interviews and surveys. We identified focus areas, did a really great and stakeholder workshop, interactive, bringing in total with the other missions more than 100 people together, and identified pathways and developed them such that they can actually have the maximum impact. We ask ourselves, so which are the entities that have the most impact, and what kind of significant factors do they have to diet? We explored food-related solutions. We thought about which populations, was taking place in Europe, are most likely to be impacted and should thus be targeted, and which domains should EIT Food prioritize. There's so many different strategies that you can take, but which domains should EIT Food prioritize, and which stakeholders should be involved and why? So these were the kind of main research questions in the background. And with that, let's move on to pathways. Exactly. So we use the concept of pathways to translate clear value propositions. The overall mission was very broad. So we thought of three sub sort of missions, and we called them pathways that together reflect the priorities we identified together with the stakeholders. So in order to actually healthier life years for all, we identified a pathway that would achieve a balanced diet for both people and planet, which is rather broad, but contains some very significant ideas on how to proceed. We had one pathway that focused on protein source diversification. So we're just still having too much meat on our plates. So how can we diversify those sources for protein? And the third pathway was actually can we actually improve the nutrient density of our food? So a broader and two more targeted pathways are kind of the backbones of the mission. So that was kind of the outcome of the scoping. And when we talk about shaping, we really try to engage very intensively with a diverse set of stakeholders. And this is actually showing you the how. So how did we engage with them? How do we co-produce pathways? We gathered these stakeholders for 2 days of workshops. The stakeholders came not only from EIT Food, we made a deliberate effort also to include stakeholders from beyond EIT Food. We even had international guests there, and we shared the vision with them, made sure that they are behind the vision, and then started actually with ideating outcomes. And outcomes was really important to make it more tangible. So what are transformative outcomes? we even asked them, when would you see success? How would you see success? So really make it more tangible. We provided them also with trends and drivers so that they could actually even go one step further, identify concrete needs and opportunities. And then we asked to prioritize the opportunities. Opportunities, if you remember, are really important in terms of how can we actually sense and seize them for making these dynamic capabilities come to life. Then we went into enablers and resources. So if we have those opportunities, what is needed in terms of enablers and resources? And then started to build also the pathway on a timeline. So make sure sort of what is the first important step, what critical milestones could be expected. And with these pathways, we actually went back full circle then to the outcomes and checked if the two would match. So the pathways, do they still meet the outcome? Would they meet the expected outcomes, or should we actually adapt those? So that was actually the full work for 2 days. And as I showed you, we had 3 missions. So we also tried to align our mission, Healthier Lives Through Food, with the other 2 missions to make sure that EIT Food has a very robust basis and also aligned missions to start their own work with our foundations. Okay, and with that, I would like to show you a bit more on not only the pathways, but also what we identified as kind of cross-cutting important enablers or leverages. And that was interesting in us for because it also then translated into enabling factors for other missions. For instance, that collaborations and partnerships are becoming increasingly important, not only within, but also beyond the food system. So food and energy, food and agriculture, food and transport, for instance. Yeah. And we also found across the missions, but particularly here, that consumers need to better understand and learn how to prevent non-communicable diseases with their diets. So it's about food consumption and also food citizenship. Knowledge infrastructure is really important. Knowledge and data are really dispersed across different sources. We need to bring those together, and that could also be part of the mission and its the mission specific ecosystem to bring all the knowledge together and make it accessible to improve not only production and consumption patterns, but also achieve better health impact. And last but not least, it's always about regulation and policy frameworks that need to support a faster development and uptake of new products and technologies. So there's a variety of different innovation types that are necessary. Still, we need more new products and technologies. We need social innovation. We need organizational innovations, but still new products and technology also need to be developed. And in terms of the mission itself, we thought that 3 key domains are necessary to focus on. The first one is what is called produce in the visual. It's really about production. And in the production of food, we need to focus more on healthier ingredients in the product. In terms of transformation, kind of in the food processing bit, we need to develop more technologies to safeguard the nutrient density. So you can also see some of the pathways here. And when it comes to actually distributing, making food accessible, the mission should also prioritize the supply chain, because we saw that from agriculture to production to consumption, there are some gaps, for instance, in retail. We have to focus there as well to make sure that we have more healthy food on our plates, and that will eventually have an impact on our healthy life years. Yeah, so I think with that, I'm more or less done with my presentation here, just to give you a glimpse of like a half year later after our mission was done, we had still continued to work to make sure that the cross-cutting issues like protein diversification became an important part of all three missions. Regenerative agriculture was another cross-cutting important aspect, and retail and out of home food was also something identified as critical. Just to give you a glimpse of what started as one mission actually became quite complicated, but hopefully also very impactful framework for EAT Food to work for more healthy life years for all. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Recommend to have a look at our Healthier Lives Through Food Insight report, where we actually put all the scientific and process insights for everyone to have a look at. As I said, EAT Food picked the parts that they would start with. And yeah, with that, hopefully contributing to a transformative mission in Europe and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra. Thanks for sharing the story of EIT Food and your personal and professional experience with them, as you said. And we're gonna switch over to CSIRO now, and we have Simon Fielke and Amelia Olsen-Boyd present. Simon is a research scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CSIRO, Australia's National Science Research Agency. Simon conducts applied human geographical research on collaborative innovation processes, which involves conceptualizations of challenge-led, mission-specific, and responsible innovation. And Simon is presenting together with Amelia Olsen-Boyd. She's the Executive Manager, Mission Innovation at CSIRO. Amelia leads a multidisciplinary team developing mission-oriented strategies and innovation practices at CSIRO. And together with her team, she designs new initiatives for mission implementation with a focus on strategic design, portfolio strategy, and public value measurement. And with that, I'll hand over to you guys.
So good evening, folks. I'll kick us off and then I'll hand over to my colleague, Simon. What we do here is start by acknowledging traditional custodians of the lands that we're joining from. So I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, and Simon is joining from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra. And we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. This evening, this is the scope of our presentation. And Simon and I are really here to talk to you about the view from inside a public research organisation that's using its own science, technology and innovation expertise as a hook to convene innovation system actors around mission agendas. And this is a really different way of instigating and operationalising missions to some of the approaches that we see elsewhere in the world. Before we launch right into a discussion of exactly how that operates within our own organisation, though, I think it's really worth a couple of broader reflections about capacities for mission-oriented innovation. So we're now 5 years into developing missions in this context, and what's emerging for us is a foundational set of capacities that could almost be described as an ethos about how to be mission-oriented. If you have to boil it down, which I've done here, then I'd say it's the capacity to be humble and the capacity to be disciplined. And I think if I reflect on what Petra just said in her presentation, this idea of deliberate and purposeful action is really critical. The capacity to be humble, because nothing about missions is unilateral in its action. So mission agendas are dealing into inherently human challenges, and we need to democratize access to agenda sharing and implementation so that a range of perspectives, those that are born of expertise, but also those that are born of lived experience, are incorporated. Missions also necessitate the reconfiguration of the way important institutions relate to one another within the innovation system. And it requires setting aside past impressions or grievances and working constructively towards a shared goal, where we all collectively share in both the triumphs, but also the failures of that agenda. In terms of this discipline is required because old ways of thinking and doing die hard. We've got enough experience in innovation policy to know that if we really care about effective responses to our shared challenges, then we're going to have to do what this cartoon here suggests, which is to break out of this way of thinking that is quite magical, that there's a miracle that occurs in the process of our innovation pathway, and that public value will naturally accrue and it will trickle out from our innovation investments. We actually have to care about every single part of the innovation pathway, and not just how it's instigated, because there's a lot of enthusiasm for the vision setting and a lot of care and attention paid to the investment mechanisms. But what is really going to matter in these agendas is if we pay as much attention to implementation as we do to policy formulation. The final reflection about discipline is, because we're implementing these change agendas in a really complex and uncertain world, there's often a tendency to slip back into ways of thinking that are almost like returning to your home base, to think about what might be advantageous or beneficial for ourselves or our institutions. But what this whole agenda really requires of us is to persistently push back against these prevailing narratives and to keep returning to this question, and with apologies to President Kennedy, but asking not what our innovation systems can do for us, but what we can do for our innovation systems. And so I think that's really useful framing, because it shows the way in which, although we're talking about institutions, we're really talking about them in relation to the system that they exist in. So the system that CSIRO exists in is this one. This is the Australian context, and we've been able to update this with some information hot off the presses from last week. But what this looks like is a set of challenges that's going to differentially impact us. So we know that we have these global grand societal challenges as embodied in the SDGs, but there are differential impacts. And we know this because Australia is at once one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world and one of the continents most deeply affected by climate change. So the transition to net zero has been described by one of our government ministers as the mission to end all missions in this country. At the same time, we have this persistent decline in our innovation performance. So over the past 25 years, despite this extraordinary world-leading research sector that we have in this country, the economic complexity has decreased so that we're now ranked 82nd out of 131 countries in terms of economic complexity. At the same time, we're being buffeted by these global trends around sustainability transitions that need to take place in the context of growing geostrategic instability and competition between friendly nations. And so what we're then seeing is, as of last week, the resetting of a narrative around economic and industrial policy in this country. And so this is an excerpt from an address by our Prime Minister that he made last week called A Future Made in Australia, where he said that the game has changed and the role of government needs to evolve. We need sharper elbows when it comes to marking out our national interest, and we need to be willing to break with old orthodoxies and pull new levers to advance the national interest. And so all of these things are part of the context in which CSIRO as an organisation operates. So CSIRO is one of the largest multidisciplinary research organisations in the world. We are instituted by an act of parliament. And what's really handy here is that we can see that baked into CSIRO's foundational act of parliament is a mandate and a requirement that we conduct our research in a way that makes us almost inherently mission oriented. So if I look here, we're to conduct research for the benefit of Australian industry, but also for the benefit of the Australian community and to further the national objectives and interests. And so that has created over the course of the last 70 years, a dynamic that places CSIRO in this really unique position in the innovation system. And what that means is we can act as an effective broker of knowledge and agendas between government, community, research and innovation and industry, which has positioned us really well, as Simon's about to get into, to experiment with different forms of innovation, of which missions is the most recent iteration. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Simon for a little bit to talk us through that innovation history.
Thanks, Amelia. And thank you, Petra, for a great introduction to this kind of talk as well. I guess a big part of what I'm going to talk about for the next few slides is that as an organisation, necessarily, CSIRO has been evolving since we began. And some of the most recent incarnations of kind of how we frame that up involve us calling ourselves Australia's Innovation Catalyst. That's kind of pre-2017 logic. There was then a specific investment around responsible innovation, sort of born out of the European Innovation Studies language, but particularly applied in concert with our other future science investments. And then subsequently a sort of mission-oriented investment, kind of 2020 and beyond. So the way I kind of like to think about these things is that we're part of these innovation cycles as an organization, and we shift through them depending on sort of what's most appropriate for where we are given our certain responsibilities. If we could go to the next slide, I will explain a little bit about how that looks in practice. So part of that's involved us kind of trying to understand better how science and technology investment impacts not just now and in the short term, but the kind of time horizons further out. So if we think about kind of sustainability transitions and the generations that we expect things like the transition to net zero to take, we're really talking about the process of developing the research and development pipelines through that future science and marrying that up with the sort of core business that we do day to day. And so that's important work for the federal government, for clients, really strategic partnerships that were built over a long time. And the mission-oriented innovation work that Amelia has really graciously led and been part of in this organisation has sort of filled that gap between the Horizon 3 out there in the future science and the current business that our research organisation kind of conducts with clients right now, and draws those things together. So it convenes really important actors around future goals that sort of bridge that pathway from Horizon 3 back to current day kind of delivery for clients. If we could go to the next slide, Amelia. And so what's really important to understand about that is that this is a long-term process, like realizing how we had gaps in that impact horizon timeline was a process of, over a decade, but from the start of kind of investing in the format of what were our future science investments through kind of linking that to missions and the convening power of missions as CSRO. And so it requires a kind of understanding and ability to build visions and understand scenarios of futures that don't exist yet across different periods of time. So what does the world look like 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now? So these are real kind of challenging capabilities and capacities to build. But as Amelia says, it's sort of baked into the ethos of the organisation. So for 100 years, the organisation has been doing this stuff. We've been thinking about what's the challenge, what's the research pipeline we need to set up to address that challenge into the future. And so that's really exciting. And I'll throw it back to Amelia now to talk through the specifics of our missions.
Thanks, Simon. So this is the current portfolio of missions that CSIRO has. So whereas Petra is dealing with 3 submissions across, and then she has 3 missions, CSIRO at various points has had 13 of these in the pipeline. And I think the critical difference between the way that we have operationalized mission orientation and the way that it's happened elsewhere is that this portfolio approach has allowed us to do 2 things. It's allowed us to experiment with specific mission agendas without betting the whole bank on it. So what we've been able to do here is say we will stand up and test with our external system whether or not there's appetite to pursue a mission in a specific space. And if there's not, we will use the governance processes that we have built to quickly exit that, or to provide other pathways beyond the missions program for that activity. What it's also allowed us to do is to start to think, and this gets back to the framing that Christoph gave us at the beginning of this session, to start to think about transformation in the aggregate. So rather than expecting any one of these individual missions to in and of itself achieve that transformational change, we start looking at it at that whole of portfolio level. It's also allowed us to experiment with different kinds of missions. So not just different research agendas, but also missions that are leaning more into the acceleration of new industry creation in this country, or the transformation of incumbent systems. And so these different, we can over time test whether or not these specific mission modalities are more or less successful in achieving their goals, or at least that's the idea. So as you can see here, the missions are situated within a broader challenges architecture that the organisation defined in 2016 that covers these 6 broad areas that you see across the top. Now, those areas were identified using a series of inputs, foresighting, but also understanding of industry and government priorities. And then there was a recognition of the fact that that alone was not sufficient to guide or direct action, and that what we needed was these really clear, specific goals which sit below each of the missions. And so just to briefly run you through, sorry. One moment, what's happening? Here we go. So just to briefly run you through what this process actually looks like in practice, we run an initial 6-week sprint. So we have a very design-led process in the way that Petra also described, where we start with an assessment of these challenges. And what we're really looking for is what is the most complex, urgent, and material part of those challenges that really warrants using a mission-oriented approach. And you can see some of the questions that we've been able to pull out, and I'll point you to the last one, which is this question that I alluded to earlier around how do we decarbonize the hardest to abate sectors in this country in a way that also provides a just transition for regional communities. And that's a really vexed issue in Australia. What we then do is convene our internal research expertise to and use this design process also as a political instrument to gain buy-in. So when we run mission agendas through our own institution, we do that by consent. And so we need each of the researchers to release capability, their own research expertise and capability to help execute these agendas. And if they're not brought into them from the bottom up, from the ground, then we potentially run into problems. We then also have to go out into the innovation system and start to build support within the innovation system. We do this acknowledging that there is no one way to achieve any of the objectives that we've set. And so we deliberately build into our design process a theory of change framework that contemplates multiple different pathways to achieve these goals. Those multiple pathways may be more or less coalesced around technology build, demonstration and dissemination, and socio-technical behavioural policy and regulatory change that's required. So that's how some of our missions are structured. The goal here is that you keep iterating. So missions last for a 5 to 7 year time frame in the CSIRO context. And what we're looking for here is that you don't set and forget, but that we have structured a stage gates process that requires mission managers to return quite frequently to the question of whether or not the agenda they've set is still legitimate, and whether or not the partnerships and activities that they've activated are sufficient to reach the goal. And so this gets back to this scale and dissemination of solutions. So that's the innovation process that we're running. What that implies about the kinds of practices is the last couple of things that I want to touch on before handing back to Simon. So what we see here on the left is the kind of traditional innovation processes that many of us will be familiar with that tend to start from this current day state. They tend to be quite focused on outputs rather than outcomes. They're project focused. They're top down. Governance is seen as an expense. And in terms of catalyzing innovation, we tend to think about these internal labs and teams. And what mission orientation implies is that we have to start from an analysis of the future and work backwards. So there's a huge leap in our understanding that requires that people who are engaging in this process can leave behind a series of preconceived notions of what the solutions might be, and can engage in a really generative examination of what is the future that we want, or what are the possible futures that we want. it's a process that really needs to deal into the innovation system dynamics. And that's because in the Australian context, really practically, we don't have billions of dollars of investment to galvanize this activity. So we have to pay really, really close attention to who are the actors that we're likely to be able to crowd in. It has to be really focused on the portfolio for the reasons that I've just explained. It needs to be highly experimental. It needs to be capable of scaling up or scaling down activity. And this idea of governance as a common good. So one of the things that's really emerging for us in our practice as we scale missions into the external system is this need for new ways to govern across institutional boundaries and to think about that governance as a key mechanism for actually delivering those outcomes and not a cost. So finally, what do all of those concepts actually imply about the capabilities and capacities that we need? What we're really seeing is starting from this analysis of the future requires not only analytical capability, but also generative and creative capability. So yes, we need foresighting, we need systems intelligence, but equally we need people who can engage in a really imaginative process of collectively working out what a set of ideal futures would look like in order to drive towards them. We need strategic design capability that can then take those visions of the future and work out how to operationalize them through these multiple pathways to impact. We need portfolio managers who are deeply embedded and engaged with the actual activity, the ongoing implementation of our missions, so that they're able to feed back their insights into the process of redesigning our missions. And finally, these questions about collaborative governance and leadership. And so Petra touched on these ideas of knowledge infrastructures and starting to think about the way new knowledge systems and infrastructures can actually help to support this collaborative governance. You know, sunlight being the best disinfectant, perhaps by democratizing access to some of the knowledge that's required, we allow a whole new series of actors to get involved in these mission agendas. So that's just some practical capabilities and capacities. And now I'm going to hand back to Simon, who's going to give us a case study to really ground this.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. And I was struck by some of the similarities to Petra's talk in providing this sort of case in point to explain sort of how do we operationalize, even within one particular mission, a work package within a mission, and then the activities under that work package, and how do we kind of really make real the process of bringing together multiple organizations. So this is one example that I've been most involved in. It's it sits under our drought resilience mission. The aim of that mission is to reduce the impacts of drought by 30% this decade. So that's a pretty significant, broad and high level aim. Under that sits a number of work packages to try and address that in different ways. And it's also a sort of partnership with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, our federal department. One of their key themes and a source of funding for the Climate Services for Agriculture program is the Future Drought Fund. Under that Future Drought Fund, a core priority is better climate information. So there's a number of sort of things swirling around there already. And as part of that better climate information ask, the pitch was made for our Climate Services for Agriculture program and what is now the flagship user interface, which is My Climate View. So all these things, these links are publicly available if you want to find out more. But I'm just trying to kind of frame how this particular operationalization and new product and technology that we need, which were Petra's words, came about as part of a mission-oriented innovation process in order to both develop a technology that provides the agricultural sector with future climate projections out to the 2080s, to build new sectoral capabilities, and consider future climate projections in Australia. So there's a number of papers coming out that are speaking to this now. One of them's here. If we go to the next slide, I'll show you what the interface looks like as you enter it. And it's like this. And basically you enter where you are. And if you have a commodity, you don't have to, you could just enter general. It'll tell you what is likely to change between now and well, from anywhere up 2050 to 2080, given different climate scenarios. So all those organisations down the bottom sort of collaborating in different ways within an actual project or program, the Climate Services for Agriculture program. Not sure when. Oh, what? Sammy might have had something to say about that. But yeah, all these organisations, big and reputable organisations, collaborating around this particular technological investment that has multiple layers. And in thinking about what Amelia and Petra have said, I could think of a number of examples of small sort of micro interventions within meetings in those processes where it could have gone a very different way, where having a different, you know, potentially competitive attitude toward another organisation or a less open one might have changed the direction of how that particular interaction went. But this was really led strongly by the drought resilience mission leader and colleagues in the Bureau of Meteorology and DAF. So a really interesting example. If we go to the next slide. So before I hand back to Amelia to talk about mission orientation at CSIRO into the future, the next phase of this is we've got a really strong investment within that CSA program around the exploration of scaling. How do we take, you know, what is a really important tool to the sector, think about how it might influence other sectors, other types of knowledge and innovation systems, not just the agricultural one. How do we examine kind of the different partnerships that are involved in that? How do we involve, you know, and build on the role of responsible innovation as a practice within that development community, product-wise and kind of co-production-wise? And how do we scale that particular effort of responsible and inclusive innovation out to other research programs, etc.? And how do we apply kind of the scientific learnings within and across these different missions and the human capabilities built and marry that up with non-human capabilities? There's an exciting large language model addition to that My Climate View application that might help. It's still in kind of early stages, but it might help query and you know, provide more instant responses, make clearer some of the information that comes back for those who may not otherwise understand it as well. So some really interesting stuff there. I'll throw it back to Amelia.
Thanks, Simon. And our last slide, where to next? So if we think about the story of mission orientation in the Australian context and within our organisation, then we've been experimenting with models that have been relatively modest in scale. And so one of the key questions now is that we've proved out the appetite for this model. We're starting to see increasing traction in our innovation system for these ideas, people wanting to work out how to work in this way. Then the key thing is how to scale mission orientation. And when we're thinking about this question of mission orientation and scaling, I keep coming back to this work by some colleagues at the Griffith Centre for Systems Innovation, which is about this concept of right scaling and a series of choices that we can make about whether we want to scale deep or wide or up. And in this kind of framing, there are a series of choices that we can make that can guide our organizational strategy. I think it's fair to say in this moment that our organization is considering ways to further embed and mainstream mission-oriented approaches, all of those capabilities that I previously outlined, and thinking about how that might be brought to bear on more of our research at the moment. We have something in the realms of 900 full-time equivalent researchers working on missions out of 4,500. So it's still a relatively small scale activity within the organization, and thinking about how we broaden that out. The other thing to call attention to is the fact that in the Australian context, and I note that we also have Sally Davenport on the call here. Sally's a colleague from New Zealand who is much more knowledgeable about this than I am. But there are these questions about what is the unique value proposition that the Australian and New Zealand context can bring to innovation practice, and a recognition of the fact that, particularly in the Australian context, we have not even begun to scratch the surface of the ways in which that 65,000 years of Indigenous knowledge could be brought to bear on our innovation practice, and specifically thinking about the fact that that 65,000 years worth of knowledge, promulgating knowledge systems, sustained the resources of an entire continent, was really, really adept at thinking through these questions of interdependency and thinking naturally in systems, and also thinking in deep time. And so there are ways in which these Indigenous knowledge systems could be brought to bear on an innovation practice, and that I'm really encouraged to see that in the consultation for our new national science and research priorities, Australia has placed Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge at the centre of our new priorities. So I think that's a huge untapped well of potential there for us moving forward. With that, I'll hand back to you, Christoph.
Thanks, Amelia, and thanks, Simon, and thanks also for reflecting on the importance of the Indigenous knowledge in helping us think these challenges through. We have already a fair bit of questions and comments in the chat. We've noted them down. What's happening next, though, is we're going to move to breakout sessions. So you'll be randomly assigned to breakout rooms, and you will have some time to ask those questions in the breakout rooms. In case you don't manage to find all the time for all your questions, I've noted them down, and we can also bring them back to the plenary later. But for now, Annie, if you could assign us to the breakouts, that would be fantastic. Okay. Great. Everyone's back. Well, I hope you had a good discussion. We certainly had. It was fascinating hearing more from Amelia. We would like to ask you now to put down some of the key takeaways from the discussions you just had. What surprised you? What were some of the lessons learned? What were some of the points you would like to share with the others here in the chat? And we'll give you a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds, 60 seconds to do that. And then Vicky and I will moderate a bit of a discussion. We've also noted the questions from before down, but a bit of time for you to write down your bullet points. All right, Victoria, should we start? Did you have any points that stand out for you that you would like to post to the panel or to everyone, really?
I noticed that Manuel had a question earlier in the call that I'm not sure has been addressed yet, in terms of how these capabilities and capacities are built in.
Yeah, indeed. Carla had that question too. She asked, I think this was directed to Amelia and Simon, how have you gone about building those capabilities within CSIRO? And how do you make this process resilient so that those capabilities stay if leadership changes or political leadership changes?
Yeah, I might have a go at answering that in the first instance, and then Simon can give his perspective from his side of the fence. I think that so if I reflect on so I co-lead the program office at CSIRO, which is responsible for a bunch of innovation practice functions, but also for the portfolio management. And if I think about where we started 5 years ago, we were paper pushers. We were taking board papers and submitting them to board, and then crossing things out and sending them back to the mission leads. And that was sort of acting as an intermediary dealing into the existing systems. I think how we built the capability that we've built is that we very much serendipitously managed to hire a really extraordinary group of people who were very, very values oriented. So they all deeply believe every single person who works in this office has come to this organization to work on missions. And so they're deeply invested in a mission oriented agenda. And so they've just been very motivated and capable to build up those skills themselves. And so what we're really seeing is, for example, one of our team members who came on board as a change manager has retrained as a facilitator and strategic designer over the course of the last 5 years. She's bringing all of that change knowledge, which is so critical, and bringing it to bear on what we acknowledge to be a political process, which is trying to build consensus around these mission agendas through the design process. It's kind of there's a reflection in so Rainer Cattell from UCL has this reflection in his most recent book where he invokes the invisible hand, which is this concept that you set out with these really bold agendas that you have no idea how to prosecute, and then sort of necessity is the mother of invention. And that is very much what's happened at CSIRO, that just by dint of the need to build these skills, we've built them. And then I think the capacity to crowd in a community of like-minded people who can challenge but also support has been critically important. And so I think we've built enough of a critical mass of that that there is I think a broader sense that this work is legitimate, even if leadership or political circumstances might change. I think that's critically important to the longevity and resilience of the teams. But Simon, I don't know if you have any further reflections from your side of the fence.
It's wonderful, Amelia. I do. I will reflect back to you what I just heard you say, which was in the kind of conceptual world language, you went from being a sort of process intermediary, someone who was just there to kind of facilitate a process, send the board papers, receive them back, edit them, whatever else, to almost sort of, in my brain, I think about the missions, each of them, as a sort of niche. They're trying to kind of influence the regime, but they're still sort of, they're new, and they're not, there can be different levels of disruptive, and they involve sort of powerful players. But you sort of made a case for the office to be more than just a process intermediary, and one that actually has a critical role in almost strategic intermediation and coming up with how the idea of how a portfolio of missions should be received or kind of weighted and across those things. So I think that's a really great story. And kudos to you and the team for doing that, because as you say, if we didn't get you guys, may have been a different story, may still have just the kind of process intermediation function. From the kind of research side of the fence, a lot of our conversation was about how do you engage in these sorts of concepts as trained scientists in specific disciplinary backgrounds. And I sort of gave the example of each of our mission leads sort of being like an institutional entrepreneur. They've got some kind of energy or passion, or they don't necessarily see themselves as that sort of career scientist. They've got something about them that is driving them to have that sort of impact in convening and pushing boundaries where they can, and maybe seeing how that whole system can be influenced. I think that's been a key kind of attribute. And then underneath that, you've got to have like almost different levels of capability and capacity depending on what the particular role. So, you go down below a mission, you've got your work packages. If you go down below that, you've got the some research programs and their teams. But that's what I heard. And I don't know if Petra has anything from the AIT perspective on that.
Yeah, so from what I've been observing and over the past year since these missions have been implemented is really actually very much also similar to what your experiences are, really a change in the EIT Food team, in the structures, in the people. And it's really, Amelia, you said absolutely what I would underscore. It's really, you need the dedicated people. You need the diversity of the skills they bring in, but also this kind of shared understanding and also I would even say it's not only the individual, but it's really the team effort that makes it all. And and this kind of an attitude towards open and responsible innovation, I would say. Being open and also fostering this kind of being responsible, not only for the topic, but in the way they're acting also towards each other and towards the rest of the organization, having those, making it accessible. Yeah, and I also read about, it's not only about formal learning. I would say rather on the contrary, it's a lot about informal learning within the teams and also as a boundary organization. I really like the word, Amelia. It's really making sure to actually make the boundary function a really strong one as well. And that for me is a very strong leadership aspect. Yeah, that is not something that you can really learn by the book. This is what that's experiential learning, social learning in the end.
Wonderful end to this, Petra. Thank you very much, because what we're doing here is also social learning, one form of it at least. Thanks, everyone. I'm recognizing we're already a bit over time. Thanks to the experts for generously sharing their experiences and for sharing the knowledge with us. It's really appreciated. Please keep an eye out for the Open Learning Series event space. There will be more to come. We will have one in May and then also in June that are starting to line up. And Vicky, I think, is going to post a link to a LinkedIn discussion group or connecting group on Tipsy and the Open Learning. Yeah, thanks, Vicky, for that. And yeah, thanks everyone thanks everybody, and thank you very much for joining, and I wish you a wonderful day or an evening wherever you are. Thank you.